In the dry, wind-blown summer of 1873, travelers arriving in the town of Millbrook, Kansas, could see little on the horizon but endless grass and the occasional distant herd of dusty cattle. The world seemed raw and new, yet hardship pressed on every soul. Into this landscape strode Reverend Josiah Crane, tall, gaunt, and with eyes the color of storm clouds. He arrived with nothing more than his threadbare valise and a conviction that burned from his tongue with every word. He began his preaching not in the church, a sagging frame without steeple, but in the open fields beneath the withered cottonwoods near the river. There his voice gathered the weary hearts of the town like salt draws water. He promised salvation in language so passionate and urgent, it stripped people of their doubts. "The kingdom is close, closer than your next breath," he declaimed. "You must be cleansed, body, soul, and mind. Repent." From the moment he arrived, Crane seemed to sense both the hunger and fear that threaded through Millbrook's small community. In 1873, the shadow of recent cholera outbreaks lingered, and prairie fires had devastated the wheat crop. People were primed for a message of hope, and for the first time in months they crowded together in the fields. Farmers, widows, rough-faced cowhands, women in worn calico, listening as if their lives depended on each syllable. Rumors about Crane's origins spread quietly among the townsfolk. He claimed to have preached in Texas and Missouri, and some said they'd heard tales of fiery revivals in places with names they couldn't find on any map. Yet his knowledge of Scripture and his gift for oration dispelled doubt. He was a true outsider, neither seeking nor accepting the hospitality of the townsmen. Instead, he slept in barns or beneath the sky. Even the pastor of the local church, a gentleman named Thomas Whitley, found himself unsettled by the preacher's charisma. With each new sermon, more townspeople began to attend. Especially drawn were those who had lost the most: children to fever, land to drought, parents to accident. For those, Crane's message was a balm. "The fire of suffering burns away the dross," he declared, his voice cutting through the night. "We shall rise anew, pure in faith, if only we dare to believe." Soon, Crane's influence spread beyond town meetings. He made private house visits, praying for the sick, laying his hands on fevered foreheads. Some blamed his manner for the children's nightmares. He spoke of damnation with the same conviction as he promised deliverance. Yet such was the power of his words that even those most skeptical found it difficult to turn him away. As the weeks passed, Crane established a regular gathering, first in the field, then in August, within Whitley's own church, which he filled to bursting every Sunday. Here Crane introduced rituals that the people of Millbrook had never seen: long, intense sessions of confession, fasting, and nights of shared prayer that left participants both drained and exhilarated. Their faith became performative, communal, something enacted with each motion, each tear shed, or prayer whispered in the flickering light. But Crane was never content with simple expressions of faith. He railed against what he called hollow Christianity, demanding from his followers proof of true devotion. "Would you suffer for the Lord?" he thundered. "Would you trust him even unto death?" He spoke of a deeper cleansing, one that required not just words, but profound sacrifice. Some left, disturbed by the extremity of his teaching, but many stayed, hearts swollen with new zeal, yearning for the assurance that only total surrender could bring. Among those drawn into his orbit were the townsfolk's most vulnerable: Sarah Jacobs, newly widowed at 23, William Foster, who lost 3 children to fever, old Mrs. Stroud, already losing her memory to age. Crane gave their grief purpose, recasting their suffering as holy trial. It was in these gatherings by lantern glow that Crane began to sort his flock, those willing to go furthest, who hung on his every word. They became his disciples, allowing him to guide their souls more completely. One blazing afternoon, as thunderheads gathered in the west, Crane called a meeting unlike any before. "The time has come," he preached, voice trembling with fervor, "for God to test his chosen. You must demonstrate ultimate faith, the faith of Abraham, willing even to be buried, trusting the Lord for resurrection as he promised in the Scriptures." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. They expected a metaphor, a ritual, perhaps an all-night prayer. What Crane proposed was literal, a symbolic burial, each believer lain in a shallow grave in the field and covered with earth while the congregation prayed for their rising. Such an ordeal, he claimed, would purify the soul, showing outward sign of inward conversion. Some recoiled at once, horrified by even the suggestion, but others, a surprising number, were so desperate for meaning, for salvation, that they agreed to prepare themselves for the ordeal. For them, suffering was already a daily condition. To give that suffering religious form was, in some way, a relief. What they could not know, as night fell and the willow branches shivered above them, was how far their faith would stretch, and how willing a man like Crane was to test the bonds of trust he had so artfully spun. Preparations began the following morning, before word had a chance to reach the few remaining skeptics who might have stopped it. A fever gripped the select group. Crane's disciples moved about town eerily focused, gathering tools, digging trenches on the far edge of Yarrow Field, where the wild grass grew highest. Crane dictated every detail. Each shallow grave would be just deep enough to hide a body. Boards were laid inside as a precaution, he said, to prevent suffocation. The Lord promises resurrection, not folly. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had foreseen every outcome, soothing doubters with Bible verses and tales of holy men who'd been buried and raised by faith. The ritual was set for sunset, timed so that when the last rays faded, the congregation would pray for deliverance and the chosen would arise. Prior to the event, Crane insisted his disciples fast and confess their sins. Sarah Jacobs wept with exhaustion, clutching a kerchief as Crane prayed at her bedside, urging her to trust with every fiber of her being. By late afternoon, the curious and the devout gathered at the edge of Yarrow Field. A few whispered that what they were about to witness was madness. Still, none dared stop Crane. He spoke privately with each participant, Sarah, William Foster, Mrs. Stroud, and two young farmhands named Eli and Jonas. To each he promised that this act would deliver them from suffering, wrapping his reassurances in the glow of their grief-stricken hope. One by one, as dusk fell, the disciples stepped into their open graves. The congregation sang hymns as others gently covered them with soil and straw, leaving faces uncovered but limbs pinned beneath the earth. Some lay trembling, others calm, unblinking, as if they had already transcended the pain of their lives above ground. Crane paced among the mounds, arms raised, voice soaring in prayer. The atmosphere was feverish. Some in the crowd went to their knees, hands shaking with fervor. "Hold fast," Crane commanded, his voice both comforting and absolute. "The Lord is testing you as he tested his son in Gethsemane." Night deepened. Above, the sky churned with thunder. Prayers rose and fell in the darkness, and some began to falter, worried by the length of the ordeal. William Foster began to thrash beneath the soil, gasping for breath. "Trust the Lord," Crane cried. "This pain is the price of paradise." But his encouragement became more distant, his words sounding less like prophecy and more like command. The chorus of prayers wilted as the congregation tired. Crane rebuked them, demanded their voices remain strong, that their faith must not falter at the hour of reckoning. Some children in the group began to cry. Others pulled at their parents' sleeves, begging to leave, frightened by shadows and the scent of earth. As midnight approached, lightning illuminated Crane's silhouette, now a dark shape against the night, still exhorting his flock to hold firm. Some in the crowd shrank from him, disturbed by a glimpse of steel in his eyes. Yet no one dared cross him, and so the vigil continued, long into a night that seemed to stretch out of time. When the first bird sang at dawn, there was a scramble to exhume the disciples. Some emerged gasping, eyes wild, forever changed, but two, old Mrs. Stroud and Jonas the farmhand, were still. The crowd froze, confronted with the unthinkable. Crane declared them martyrs, resurrected in spirit if not in flesh, insisting their faith was purest. The line between ritual and atrocity had burst, and doubt for the first time shaded the town's collective heart. In the wake of the burial rite, Millbrook was seized by confusion. For some, traumatized by the loss of loved ones, grief warred with loyalty to Crane. Others feared the preacher and what he represented, yet felt powerless in a town so small with lawmen far away and little order. but that established by church and rumor. Reverend Crane pivoted quickly. He held a service for the dead, framing the failure of the ritual as a sign of deeper impurity among the townsfolk, not in his teachings. He thundered about forgiveness, urging the congregation to root out doubt, even as fresh graves were dug with trembling hands in the cemetery on the hill. The sheriff, a kindly and weak-voiced man, deferred to townsfolk who argued that it would be sacrilege to accuse a preacher, especially one who had comforted so many. Rumors warped into paranoia. Some whispered that those who survived burial glowed with a strange inner fire. Others swore they heard Mrs. Stroud's voice on the wind at night. In reality, the survivors, Sarah, William, Eli, struggled with nightmares and guilt, isolated by the trauma. Yet they remained in Crane's orbit, unable to separate their fear from faith. Crane redoubled his efforts. "The Lord will separate the wheat from the chaff," he roared at Sunday gatherings, and more fervent rituals followed. Some townsfolk left outright, abandoning farms and kin. Others clung more tightly to Crane, drawn by an addiction to certainty, as if faith itself were a fever not easily broken. The preacher's closest followers grew more insular, meeting privately at Crane's urging. He instilled in them the belief that persecution by neighbors was proof of their chosen status. True faith demands surrender, he taught, not comfort, not consensus. He chose Sarah as his confidant, encouraging her to testify about her vision beneath the earth, how in darkness she felt a peace she'd never known. Hesitant at first, she became his most effective apostle, retelling her ordeal as proof of God's mysterious grace. Dissent rose in small, covert gatherings. Townsfolk met late at night in Mr. Braxton's store, or whispered in twos and threes at the river's edge, their voices hoarse with fear of being overheard. Some wanted to confront Crane, while others argued for the law, but as sure as the wind scoured the plains, Crane seemed untouchable. Sheriff Platt, heavily pressured, muttered that Crane's rituals weren't technically murder, if they volunteered themselves, and that without witnesses or evidence of wrongdoing, his hands were tied. In desperation, a few townsfolk sent a letter to the circuit judge in Salina, but mail moved slow, and justice felt as distant as the eastern sea. Meanwhile, Crane grew bolder, urging new rituals and promising that with unwavering faith, no more deaths would occur. Fasting and all-night prayer become the norm, and the town's rhythms warped by his command. Strange happenings multiplied. A plague of crows descended on Yarrow Field. Children suffered night terrors. Several people claimed to see Crane walking by the river during storms, his figure illuminated by lightning, as if partaking in some secret dialogue. Bound by shame and confusion, Millbrook was trapped between old superstition and new fanaticism, with Crane presiding like a dark messiah who'd twisted suffering into proof of faith. As the summer waned, weariness set in. Skeptics, cowed first by hope and then by fear, began to plot. Crane's power, they realized, was less about faith and more about fear, about how terror, dressed in the language of salvation, could seduce even the most well-meaning hearts. The seeds of rebellion were sown in whispers, in shared glances between men who'd once sat in different pews, but now united by a terrible common knowledge. This must end, before more were lost to newly turned earth in the far field. September arrived in Millbrook with a hard wind and sullen skies. The fields were pale with dust, the wheat lean and brittle. But the mood in town was tenser than ever before. For those still entangled in Crane's following, something tormented under the surface: anxiety, memories, and the discomforting knowledge of what they'd witnessed and survived. Crane, sensing the shift, doubled his efforts to bind the faithful to him. He spoke of a great persecution to come, prophesying that the world will always turn against the righteous. His disciples, especially Sarah, ever more drawn into his thrall, became both his shield and his mouthpiece. She testified more frequently, her own nightmares slowly transformed into sermons of deliverance. The line between her trauma and faith blurred, and her pain became a tool for keeping others in line. Yet Crane's influence was not unbreakable. Mr. Braxton, whose nephew Eli had survived the burial, began gathering dissenters. Small meetings in his store expanded. Clandestine plans were whispered, and resolve began to harden. Sarah's father, a farmer broken by drought, was among those who found courage to speak, though in hushed tones, of the possibility of removing Crane from the community, by force if necessary. Meanwhile, the local school teacher, a sensible woman named Emily Morgan, pressed Sheriff Platt to take action. She documented the burial and its aftermath, the deaths unpunished, the trauma among the living. Emily's clear-eyed account convinced Platt, still fearful, that steps needed to be taken even at great risk. Crane, ever watchful, caught wind of the growing resistance. He increased his hold, stoking fear of outsiders and warning that traitors in our midst courted damnation. His sermons became frenzied and the rituals more extreme. He sought public reaffirmation of loyalty, pressuring followers to renounce those who questioned him. One chilly night, when the moon hung low and the prairie winds howled, Braxton rallied the dissenters. They agreed on a plan. Braxton and 3 men would confront Crane, confront him with facts, and if necessary, forcibly remove him. Emily, meanwhile, copied her notes for the circuit judge, evidence of wrongdoing, and prepared to leave for Salina by wagon, hoping to bring swift justice. That night, the final confrontation began. Braxton's group met Crane near the church. Voices rose. Braxton spoke for the town, naming those dead, those traumatized, and the evil hidden behind Crane's revivalism. Crane laughed, a deep, hollow sound, and called down the names of his true believers, demanding they choose their allegiance. Some, trembling, wavered. Others backed away from both leader and would-be rescuers, paralyzed by fear and faith. Sheriff Platt arrived, emboldened by Emily's documentation and Braxton's support. He declared his intent to detain Crane until the judge arrived. Crane, unnerved, attempted to sway the crowd one final time. "This suffering is your path to glory," he cried. But the spell was broken. Sarah, at last understanding her ordeal, stepped away from Crane and spoke. "No more graves, no more false resurrection. We want our lives back." Under the prairie stars, with the congregation watching, Platt placed Crane under arrest. The preachers stared at Sarah and at the townsfolk, no longer as supplicants but as a community awakened. His power finally broken, he was led away into the dawn. Leaving behind a town forever changed by the darkness and hope his promises had so dangerously entwined. After the arrest of Reverend Crane, the rhythm of life in Millbrook did not return to normal. Instead, a new tension settled over the town, thick and suffocating. For days, people moved quietly, avoiding discussions of the ordeal unless behind closed doors. The church stood empty, its doorway shadowed, while the schoolteacher, Emily Morgan, locked herself in the schoolhouse, writing careful accounts for the circuit judge. Word soon reached Salina, and with it, the expectation, half hope, half dread, that someone from the law would arrive to pass judgment on what had transpired in Yarrow Field. Crane was locked in Braxton's storeroom, the town's only secure place, watched day and night by a rotation of townsfolk. Despite his confinement, he remained composed, offering prayers and sermons to anyone in earshot, as if the bars were just a minor inconvenience. He fasted with a dedication that unnerved his keepers. At night, his voice echoed through the thin walls, reciting scripture, sometimes softly, sometimes thunderously, until the town resembled a haunted congregation, unable to sleep for the memory of his voice. Sarah Jacobs was among the most affected. Freed from Crane's physical presence, yet tormented by memories of his influence, she wandered the river's edge, lost in reflection. In her guilt and anger warred. William Foster, too, found no peace. He stopped tending his fields, instead sitting for hours on the church steps, his gaze hollow, haunted by both the night of the burial and the anguish of survival. For others, especially those who had opposed Crane, the preacher's arrest offered only partial relief. Mr. Braxton and Sheriff Platt met almost daily, planning for the judge's arrival. They gathered witnesses, including the young farmhand Eli, whose recollection of the burial was confused by panic. Each account differed in detail, but all agreed on the essential horror: the volunteers' faith, Crane's fervor, the soil pressed down too firmly. The days crawled by. Some townsfolk, still loyal to Crane or cowed by fear, whispered about his unjust treatment, retelling his warnings of persecution. Division deepened. Families that had grieved together now eyed one another with uncertainty. Church attendance plummeted, while town meetings became terse and confrontational. Millbrook was a place both united and fractured by trauma, its wounds not yet beginning to heal. Emily Morgan sensed this fracture and tried to bridge it. She visited those most shaken by the burial, offering counsel, encouraging them to write or speak about what they'd endured. She saw better than most that Crane's influence was not merely spiritual, but psychological, a form of possession that would not easily be cast out by simple absence. Together, they made a plan to hold a meeting, one free from Crane's shadow, so survivors could speak freely, and the rest of the town could finally hear the truth of all that had happened. The evening of the meeting arrived, and the old church filled again, this time with neither hymns nor the sting of brimstone, but with unsure silences and the occasional stifled sob. One by one, those who had been closest to Crane recounted their confusion, their longing for meaning, and the strange peace they felt in the earth before terror returned. The reality of the ordeal settled on those who'd remained skeptical. This was not wildness or heresy, but desperation twisted by charisma and grief. The session did more than unburden its speakers. As the last testimony faded, the distinction between those who had believed and those who hadn't became less important. Pain, not faith, became their common ground. In that moment, the seeds of forgiveness and reconciliation began to take root, a process that would not unfold quickly, but had at last begun. Meanwhile, in his makeshift cell, Crane listened to the voices that drifted from the meeting house. He recognized their confessions and pain, and a shadow crossed his features, a flicker of sorrow, or perhaps calculation. For all his conviction, a crack had finally appeared in his composure. Alone at last, Crane prayed, his words slower and softer, as the prairie wind whistled along the cracks of the storeroom, bearing with it the voices of the people he'd led astray. Just before dawn, a rider approached from Salina, carrying the authority of the circuit judge. Sheriff Platt greeted the official, explained the events, handed over Emily's copious documents, and requested that judgment be passed for or against the preacher who had divided their town. The air was charged with anticipation and fear. Whatever happened, Millbrook's innocence had been lost. The trial of Josiah Crane began in the old general store, transformed into a makeshift courtroom, with the townsfolk gathered in silence outside, listening to the proceedings through open windows and thin walls. The judge, a stern-faced man weathered by years of harsh justice, read aloud Emily Morgan's account and heard the testimonies of Braxton, Sarah Jacobs, William Foster, and others. Each story deepened the sense of tragedy and confusion that had taken hold in Millbrook. Crane, for his part, offered no defense save for Scripture and his unwavering claim of good intent. "They came of their own free will," he repeated. "Faith is never safe. If a lamb is lost in pursuit of the shepherd, glory upon him in the hereafter." His words, once hypnotic, now sounded strangely empty, a shell of what had captivated Millbrook just weeks before. Sarah's testimony was the most wrenching. She described the loss of fear beneath the earth, then the terror as time dragged on, then the sharp horror in the eyes of those exhumed too late. Her voice shook, but did not break. "He promised we'd rise," she said. "He promised we'd come up changed and saved. I trusted him more than I trusted myself." The room was silent, emotion raw in every face. The trial was brief by necessity. There was no precedent for such a crime, a kind of spiritual manslaughter, woven of faith, not malice, yet ending in irrevocable loss. The judge deliberated little and delivered a judgment of banishment, declaring Crane a danger to communities that valued both law and soul. He was to be escorted by 2 deputies eastward, away from Kansas, forbidden to preach, to settle, or to seek followers again. The penalty felt to some insufficient. Others believed no prison could confine a man whose true domain was within the minds of the afflicted. Crane listened in silence, his grey eyes flat. For the first time, he moved as if weighed down, less prophet, more penitent. As he left, Sarah and a handful of survivors gathered to watch, uncertain if release or justice had truly been achieved. In their hearts, grief was not easily purged. The empty spaces left in the wake of his departure could not be filled with a verdict. But the exodus was necessary, a hard line drawn between the past and whatever hope Millbrook could claim for the future. The preacher was gone, yet the effects of his ministry lingered. Some, embittered, left Millbrook soon after, unable to stay in a place where faith and horror had become so entwined. Others sought solace in work and new rituals, picnics, barn raisings, recitals, hoping to reclaim the rhythm of life before Crane's arrival. They rebuilt not only physical structures but trust itself, brick by careful brick, day after sun-baked day. Emily's account became part of the official record, and she sent a copy to every nearby town. News of what had happened traveled slowly but surely, a caution to other communities on the thin line between hope and fanaticism. Young Eli, still haunted, found comfort in caring for the graves of Jonas and Mrs. Stroud, fashioning crosses from scrap wood and planting sunflowers that, by the next summer, would tower over the mounds, living reminders of endurance and of the price of misplaced trust. In the quiet that followed, Millbrook re-knitted itself, though never quite the same. The schoolhouse filled. Seeds were sown for spring. Some nights, Sarah sat on her porch, turning Crane's old words over in her mind. Sorrow and anger mingled, but also a new wisdom, a conviction that faith needed anchors, and that salvation could never be granted by any single voice, no matter how insistent. Through the wind and across the river, the memory of that fateful summer lingered, fading slowly, a story to be retold with each passing season, not to forget, but to remind a town that healing, like faith, is a long, difficult lesson learned by honest hearts and shared pain. In the months after Crane's departure, the weight of his legacy pressed on Millbrook like a distant thunderstorm. Grief was tempered only by the slow routine of work and the conscious attempt to look forward. Life settled into a kind of wary vigilance. The boys kept a respectful distance from Yarrow Field. Mothers held their children a little tighter, and each church service was marked by a mixture of gratitude and unease. Efforts to heal the town drew largely on the leadership of Emily and Mr. Braxton. They organized gatherings geared toward renewal rather than worship, harvest suppers, quilting bees, collective care for the sick and elderly. Old resentments between families softened, not erasing what had happened, but lessening its sharper edges. Forgiveness began to circulate, haltingly at first, then more freely, as people rediscovered the comfort of community. Sarah Jacobs found strength in connecting with others who had suffered under Crane's influence. She hosted quiet evenings in her home where survivors could talk openly, grieve their losses, and remind each other of their worth. William Foster, though still plagued by nightmares, accepted help on his farm and eventually repaid his neighbors with work of his own. These small gestures, shared meals, mended fences, were the true markers of Millbrook's recovery. Yet not all marks faded. The graves of Jonas and Mrs. Stroud remained as somber reminders. Some children developed a lasting fear of confined spaces. Others recounted strange dreams of earth and roots. Every so often, a traveling preacher passing through would be met with suspicion. Sheriff Platt, changed by his own inaction, became more diligent and open to townsfolk's concerns, determined never to let uncertainty rule again. The seasons turned. Flowers grew wild over Yarrow Field, and weddings began to outnumber funerals. By winter, laughter once again echoed from the saloon and the schoolyard. In subtle ways, Millbrook reinvented itself as a place wiser, if sadder, for its ordeal. New families arrived, drawn by opportunity, hearing only muted echoes of the summer when faith was weaponized and innocence lost. For those whose faith had once burned hot in Crane's presence, a quieter devotion emerged, a faith grown from experience and tempered by humility. Sarah, now a leader in her own right, stood at each sunrise with those who remembered, offering thanks not for deliverance from pain, but for resilience in its wake. The preacher Crane became a shadow, sometimes spoken of in hushed voices as a warning, but more often relegated to silence. His presence in town faded, but what he had revealed, both the potential for darkness and the power of collective courage, remained etched in Millbrook's soul. At year's end, Emily Morgan locked her records in the schoolhouse trunk, sealed with the promise that if the world ever became lost again, someone would know the cost of putting blind faith in a man who preached salvation while wielding the tools of the grave. As the years passed, the events of 1873 became a story, one told by parents to their children and by old-timers to newcomers under the canopy of Kansas stars. The saga of Reverend Josiah Crane was recounted with wariness and gravity, a tale of faith corrupted, of community tested, and ultimately of resilience forged in the hottest fire. Millbrook prospered despite its scars. The land recovered, crops flourished, and children born after that year treated Yarrow Field as just another part of the landscape. Only when the wind rustled through the grass in a certain way did anyone recall the terror that once gripped the town. Each spring, wildflowers choked the old graves, blurring the line between memory and growth. Sarah Jacobs married and built a family, teaching her children the hard-won lesson that hope must be anchored in reason and in the collective wisdom of many, never in one voice, no matter how beguiling. She never fully forgot those buried hours, nor the desperation that made her follow Crane, but she learned to accept her mistakes as part of a larger tapestry, woven with both pain and grace. Emily Morgan, in time, passed her careful records to the next schoolteacher. The story lived on in the town's collective memory, not as a thing of shame, but as a warning, a history that could keep new generations cautious and united against the dangers that arise when grief and longing are manipulated for power. Every few years, a stranger would stumble into Millbrook from the east, inquiring about the preacher, who had once divided and nearly destroyed the community. The story was retold, with each teller emphasizing its lessons differently, but always ending on the same note. The resilience of the human spirit, the need for vigilance, and the final wisdom of refusing easy answers when life's greatest trials come. As for the field where it happened, nature claimed it fully. The trenches of the past flattened out in memory and in the land itself. But sometimes, on the eve of storms, the elders claimed you could hear the faintest echo of singing or the sound of a sermon nearly lost on the wind. No longer a threat, but a reminder. Faith is precious, but it must never be blind. In the very final reckoning, Millbrook endured because its people chose truth over silence, community over isolation, and healing over vengeance. The grave mounds disappeared, but the resolve to honor the dead by living wisely and kindly remained, the town's truest salvation, carved not in stone, but in the daily acts of courage and care that define a people, season after hard season, for as long as memory endures. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.